Okay, sorry about that, everybody. We were having some technical difficulties. So once again, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. This is the Optus hosted versus non-hosted webinar. My name is Erica Sluter, and I am the marketing strategist here at Optus. Today, we are going to be discussing the question, are key systems going away? And to help answer this question, Optus has interviewed telecommunications industry leaders at the president and vice president level, spanning across Verizon, Windstream, AT&T, Time Warner, and Comcast, along with leadership at NEC and Avaya. Our presenter for today is Shane Lerma, engineering extraordinaire here at Optus. I'm so thankful that he could join us today to discuss this important topic. Shane has been with Optus for 11 years and is an all-around powerhouse of telecom knowledge. So before we get started, I want to let you know that because we have so many people on the line, we have everyone in attendee mode. And this means that your mics are muted to reduce line feedback. But we still want you to ask questions if you have any. So to do that, please utilize the chat or questions features in your sidebar. I will be monitoring the questions throughout the presentation, and we will take time to make sure we answer all of those. Also, after the webinar, I will email you the recording of this webinar along with a PDF that discusses what we talk about today. So without further ado, Shane Lerma, everyone.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. So as Erica alluded to, we're going to be talking about key systems today. So the discussion will kind of be around phone systems. So we'll be talking about, hosted phone systems versus on-premise systems or non-hosted systems. Now, while the discussion is kind of around phone systems itself, it really applies to any kind of hosted or non-hosted technology that you guys are used to. So we'll get this out of the way. I'll flash my picture up there. And Erica's reminded me I've worked here 11 years now and about 30 years in technology altogether. So that, while I don't want to take away from the experience that brings, it did make me realize I felt rather old when I started looking at that as well. So let's go past that slide. And we're going to talk about our current market state. So what does it really look like today? And if you've looked into hosted technology at all for your phone system or anything else, you'll notice there's a lot of options out there. There's really a lot of confusion that comes with those options. And that's really because there's a multitude of those hosted offerings, and they're coming from everybody today. You've got your traditional carriers that have been around forever, and that's the AT&T, the Verizon, the Time Warners, the Comcast. Most of those companies today have a hosted offering that they provide to their customers. And this is not really new to most of those companies. It's very similar to those of you who remember the Centrex model. So as opposed to being an analog or a digital type offering, though, the hosted offering from the carriers today is really just an IP offering. So again, lots of offerings from the carriers. And I'll kind of skip that next bullet point there and skip down to manufacturers, because that's probably the next group that has a lot of offerings out there. And these are, again, your traditional companies like the Avayas, the NECs, the ShoreTels, and Ciscos. Traditional on-premise equipment manufacturers who have dipped their toe into, in some cases, fully jumped in to the cloud offerings in the cloud world where they're offering these hosted solutions. And then really in the middle, just in our bullet point and in real life too, is that hosted service providers. So there's been a new breed of companies that's come out because of these offerings that have got a plethora of offerings out there, and these are companies like RingCentral or Vonage or 8x8. There's a lot of different companies that focus both on business as well as residential offerings. So with all of those out there, you can understand why the hosted question is a little bit confusing to some folks. And I think within the last year, traditional UC manufacturers have really started publicizing their shift in the market and introducing their own hosted models that we talked about. And as Erica alluded to, I think there were at least 8 executives across these different carriers, manufacturers, et cetera, that Optus had interviewed. And usually this was like at the vice president, president level type role that they asked this question to, the title of our webinar, are key systems going away? Because that's a question that we get asked from our side quite often. And throughout the various industry leaders, and we'll kind of skip down to that next slide, not a single executive believes that key telephone systems will be obsolete in the future. And, you know, that's pretty amazing if you think about it. And even though there's new technology, new changing things, it's pretty hard to get anyone, especially executives at this level, to agree on anything. And I mean, I know I can't even ask 3 of my close friends, and we can't agree on a movie to rent or to go watch. You know, there's a big argument that breaks out. So I think the fear that key systems are going away probably isn't there. But with that being said, that doesn't mean that things aren't changing, and they're changing pretty rapidly. And that's kind of the next couple bullet points we address there. The future of telephone systems are changing, and organizations need to be ready to evaluate those changes for their business. They need to be able to look at hosted. Does it make sense for you or does it not? And sometimes it doesn't always make sense. Sometimes it does. And, you know, there's so many different offerings out there today. There's a lot of criteria that you have to look at your own business and match that up with what the companies are offering to see if there's an overlap there and if it does make sense for you. So we'll kind of talk about going from key systems to hosted and what that looks like, and then we'll talk about some of the items to consider if you're looking at those decisions. So, you know, as those technology executives alluded to, there's a lot of changes. So even if key systems are still going to be relevant, I think we have to consider a couple of things and do a deeper evaluation of hosted solutions and on-premise and what that kind of means. And, you know, 2 of those key points when evaluating going into hosted, one of them really is security. And, you know, we can't emphasize that enough today. As we know, there's so much security concern out there today. I just noticed a couple articles last night about, you know, a technology breach that had happened and been going on for a year. And, you know, they've been using people's credit cards for a year's worth of time without anyone finding out. So a horrible breach there. You know, we've talked about in the past in other webinars some of the things that happened, you know, to Target or to the Amazon hosted services. And we know how critical it can be if there's a security concern or if something's breached, and especially if that's a third-party company that you're giving your business to. So security is of utmost concern anytime looking at a kind of a cloud or carrier offering that's of that nature. And probably the second thing to consider is, you know, the POTS sunsetting. And this is really talking about that analog trunk connection coming into your system that most of those key systems are connecting to today. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in the following slide, but you'll see most of the carriers are trying to get rid of the POTS lines out there. They don't want to deal with the analog trunks. You know, they've got a cheaper way, a better way, and it's about profitability for them. And, you know, so they're trying to drive their customers away from POTS typically toward a hosted or SIP trunk type solution. And those are the 2 we're going to dive into, but there's a third one I don't want to leave unsaid as well, and that's really, you know, the cost. That's always a factor, even if we act like sometimes it's not, because you know, we all care about, you know, what those payments are, what the cost of the system is. But that's really one of the big advantages around hosted solutions that a lot of people really find appealing. And that's really kind of moving from the CapEx to the OpEx type budget, or, you know, instead of it being a capital expense, looking at this as a monthly recurring operating expense. So, you know, with a hosted solution, you can kind of do that. And it's kind of like, you know, almost renting a house versus buying a house. And oftentimes, you know, buying might make a sense for a lot of people, but also renting has a lot of value because we know a lot of people rent. And, you know, looking at, you know, why that occurs or why it makes sense, and often the various situations we're going to take a deeper dive into. But again, that cost is a factor we need to look at, understanding that total cost of ownership, and realizing that not all hosted offers are the same. You know, some of them will include long distance, some of them won't. Some of them include the connectivity, some of them won't. So make sure when you're looking at that costing module, if I can speak today, that you're looking at all those aspects. And also make sure that if you're comparing that to like an on-premise module, you're doing as much apples to apples as you can. Because, you know, with a hosted solution, you're going to keep paying for that, you know, whether that's year 3 or year 4. And that's fine if you want to get that into your operating expenses budget as opposed to your capital. But also realize, like on the on-premise solution, you have to include often your trunking cost in that as well, because the hosted solutions will often have those carrier connectivity and often the long distance mints as well. So for a true cost comparison, we just have to make sure that we include those items as well. So let's take a deeper dive into the first of those 2 bullet points, and that'll be security. So as I mentioned, security is a concept that takes precedence over all others because, we know how detrimental it can be for a business to have a security concern, much less a security breach, something that causes them, real financial difficulty. And organizations have to decide if they want to keep their voice and data separate for security reasons or converge for efficiency. So, oftentimes that will depend upon that industry segment. And we'll see this quite a bit with the customers that we deal with. And although it's not a hard rule, it seems to be very common that a lot of healthcare, financial, and government people want to maintain that separation. They oftentimes will even maintain traditional TDM environments. Or if they do an IP environment or a hosted environment, they might want to keep that separate or keep that on a private cloud because their security, again, is of most concerns. Where you see other areas like retail or education or manufacturing, they're more willing to converge because of the cost and the efficiency that gains them. So, not true in every situation, but you can often look at that as a general rule of thumb in some market segments to realize, what some of their leading factors are or how important security is to some of them versus others. So as we mentioned, an essential step is determining whether a hosted solution is even a consideration for an enterprise organization. And we'll look at that in a little bit as well, in a little bit more detail. But, depending on the size of your organization, one thing, again, with a hosted solution is oftentimes you may not have the staff to take care of the phone system or take care of your technology. So it's very appealing to have that in a cloud or hosted environment where someone else can kind of manage and maintain that for you. And you don't have to have an FTE or someone else that's doing that that's not really an expert in that field. And let's look at the next point. Then after security, we'll look at the POTS sunsetting, if you will. And this is really carriers are migrating away from analog POTS as fast as possible. And, the reason for this is quite simple. It costs them less money. It's less money to maintain the type of connection they need for like SIP trunks or carriers or for hosted solutions than it is for traditional POTS lines. And again, if they're selling the hosted solution, that makes them more revenue as opposed to just the trunks itself. So lots of good reasons for the carriers to be doing that. And although we don't necessarily see key systems going away anytime soon, we do see POTS lines eroding very quickly. Carriers are pushing their customers away from that. If you've got customers who haven't received calls, or if you receive calls from your carrier, it wouldn't surprise me that they're trying to push you to SIP trunks or a hosted model just to eliminate those traditional physical connections at your facility. And migrating from POTS lines really creates an action item for an organization. So you have to take a look, and you've got a handful of options there once this happens. So if your carrier is kind of pushing you to remove your POTS lines, and they're pushing you to SIP trunks, there's a couple options you have. One of them is adding a gateway, and some people will call that like an IAD or maybe an AdTrans device or a media code gateway, but they'll put some kind of device to translate the SIP trunks that they're going to provide on premise to the analog trunks that your system is using today. So it's almost an interpreter, but it'll be another piece of hardware. They deliver the SIP trunks to site, and then they convert that so that you can maintain your older key system and still use, it still thinks it's using really traditional POTS lines, even though it's SIP up to that box. While that can be a good solution, especially if it saves you money from a strictly technological aspect, my engineering background just doesn't like that because it's an additional point of failure, an additional box, that sort of thing that I'd rather eliminate if I could. But again, a lot of it comes down to the dollars and cents of it, and does it make sense to do that if it doesn't make sense to upgrade the phone system or look at replacement, which of course is one of the other options here. So, next point being replace your older key system with a newer model. I think most phone systems for the last decade or so have been able to handle SIP trunk integrations. But if your system's older than that, it may be likely that it may not be able to handle SIP trunks as opposed to POTS. If that's the case, the gateway may be your only option other than upgrading the system entirely or going to a hosted model. But definitely taking a look at that and knowing if it'll do that. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of expertise here at Optus in this field, so reach out to your sales rep, reach out to the information on the beginning of the slide there that we'll share at the end, the info at, and we'll be able to evaluate. We've even got an end-of-life calculator on our website that you can go to and put your phone system in and see if that is end-of-life. If it's not, and if it's end-of-life, typically you're not going to have some of that newer technology like the SIP trunk capability. If your system is newer than 10 years, it's very likely that you have the ability to do SIP trunks. It may not be licensed or may not have the correct hardware in there to do so, but even with that being the case, it's a much better decision than just replacing the system outright. You can look at upgrading the system, adding those necessary functionality, and usually the cost of the SIP trunk savings will more than pay for that. And in some cases, that the SIP trunk savings can even pay for the whole PBX. But definitely worth reviewing your system if you are in that situation to know if it can migrate, if it can be upgraded, or what your options are. And then looking at a hosted solution. So maybe you've got an older system that can't do SIP trunks. Your carrier is pushing you away from the POTS lines. A hosted solution may be right for you. So just keeping open those possibilities and looking and investigating and doing your due diligence to make sure what your best choice is given your circumstances. So as we talked about the POTS sunsetting, we'll look at some of the other considerations specifically around SMB and enterprise and see really what makes the most sense, as these go away. And even though we talk about POTS going away, and even though key systems are probably still around for some time yet to come, it's important to realize that the market never moves as quick as a lot of the information you see out online and get from other media sources will allude to. I mean, we all will remember when they told us fax machines were going away 20 years ago, and I don't know about you guys, but I don't interact with very many businesses that don't have some level of fax machines at their businesses. They may have fewer faxes, they may have some fax servers, but there's still typically a good quantity of fax machines out there today. And again, it makes sense to eliminate, minimize where you can, but much like hosted or VoIP or anything else, it's not always the right solution. So let's again take a look at the SMB organizations. We'll kind of look at that, and then we'll look at the enterprise organizations because their needs are often different, their staffing is often different, and they can be very different organizations. Enterprise may often have multiple sites, with multiple locations. SMB may just be a small local site with a few users and a lot of shared hats as far as their staffing is concerned. So for SMB organizations, carriers have already moved heavily to hosted solutions and have stopped selling key systems. So a lot of small businesses got their key systems from their carriers, from their AT&Ts, their Verizons, Time Warners, etc. And the carriers have often sold various manufacturers in the past. They have teamed up with, the Nortels back in the day, and the Avayas and the Ciscos and the NECs and ShoreTels, and sold those manufacturers' products. Many of the carriers today, though, stopped selling those and really looked at, developing their own solution, their own hosted solution, just trying to recap that revenue. And of course, nothing wrong with that. Just being aware that that's what's happening in some of those cases when the carriers are probably the ones pushing more people away from key systems if they can for their hosted models. But they also, as all the executives realized as the carriers were interviewed, not going away anytime soon. There's just so much functionality and so many people that kind of want more control that really want to maintain the key system type functionality in their businesses today. But a lot of the decision comes down to a lot of factors, and in general, the total cost of ownership is something we want to look at that we mentioned before. And one misconception that I'll say that I hear a lot, and we've got some hosted offerings that we look at here at Optus, and we try to look at each customer's needs. We see a lot of like seasonal stores, things like that we find hosted solutions to be a great fit for. New startups and even the smaller systems. Some of the enterprise shops, not so much, but we'll talk about some options for them later. But the big misconception I would say I hear a lot is people say, well, with a hosted solution, I won't need any equipment, right? And that's not really the case. In some cases, you may need less equipment, but oftentimes you still have a fair amount, and in some cases, just as much equipment on site. And that's because, the majority of your equipment on site comes from the handsets, the phones themselves. So, everyone has a phone. When we do a hosted solution, the only thing we're really replacing is the brains of that. And we're putting that out in the cloud or at the carrier or someone else for your phones to connect back to. But for those phones to connect, we also often have to supply power, which is the PoE switches we mentioned here, and that gives them that connectivity as well. And then the cabling and infrastructure may have to change, especially if it was for more traditional, like TDM, digital or analog cabling. We have to look at that. So just evaluating if a hosted solution is right for you or not, just consider the equipment you do have to have, the routers for the carrier termination. and even the internet connectivity. Do you have a big enough pipe for that? Do you have the QoS on your connectivity for that? And again, making sure that infrastructure and your cabling is right. So making sure you're looking holistically, if you will, to make sure that you're considering all the equipment that you will need. And oftentimes, you can roll this all up into a standard payment or make it a part of the lease, or many companies may ask for just an outright payment of the equipment up front in the hosted solutions. So it just depends, again, on that solution company. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as well, but we see a lot of companies, especially in the SMB organization, they're really wanting to move from a capital expense to an operating expense. And they haven't really considered all the equipment they still have to have. They're just trying to get in at a lower cost, and that's definitely understandable. And if you're buying less equipment, that can happen. But we often have a lot of customers who realize the benefit of having on-site equipment. So as opposed to hosted, sometimes people will let us manage their on-premise solutions. So they may still have a small key system on site, but we could manage their system so they don't have to do the administration, which is one of the big advantages of a hosted solution. We can also break that in a lease or monthly payment or rental, so that again you have that operating expense as opposed to the capital expense budget. So a lot of things to consider, but again, I just ran across that misconception of, hey, I don't need equipment on site right for hosted. You still do. You may not have that one box, but you may swap that for some PoE boxes for your phones or some other items as well. So just understanding what that is, and we're glad to work with anyone to kind of work through that and understand what that looks like for your individual organization. So, you know, SMBs do often favor hosted because there's no huge upfront costs, which we just talked about, or no risky capital investment. And they can be very flexible, which is very powerful, and they can scale. So, you know, if you're at that seasonal store, the Halloween store, and, you know, you've got a rush of customers in those last few days and you need more people to man the phones, you can often easily add extensions or lines, you know, that couple of weeks before the holiday or whenever their busy times may be for any business. So the hosted solution definitely allows you to maybe plug and play a little bit more quickly, and if they kind of do the administration from the cloud side, makes it a lot easier for that small business to ramp up the number of users they have at any given time. So we've talked a little bit about SMB, and we talked about some of the reasons it makes sense there, often going from a CapEx to OpEx, the ease of administration if you don't have a staff member for that, or that's a shared job responsibility, just the flexibility that offers for those situations, and often that lower investment. Again, all make a lot of sense for the SMB organizations. So let's take a quick pause there. We'll look at enterprise organizations, but before I do, I just want to stop and see if we happen to have any questions that we need to address up to this point from Erica.
Not yet. We haven't had any questions come in. I just wanted to remind you guys that the chat and the questions feature are over in your GoToWebinar sidebar near the bottom. And so you can either send those questions privately or send it to everyone, and we will answer those as they come in.
So let's look at the hosted solutions now then from an enterprise side, and how that differs from SMB business. So, the vast majority of people that we're dealing with as far as enterprise solutions like the appeal of the cloud. They like the flexibility of it. They like the ability to spin up stations on a quick basis. But the thing they're most concerned about often is some of the items we discussed earlier around the security and really overall ownership of a cloud solution. And that really is more in effect for what we call a public cloud offering. You may hear that term from time to time. So what they often look at is a private cloud offering. And all that really means is they may want to host it, but they may want to host it inside their own environment. So that's often within their own WAN environment. If it's a large multi-site with a corporate and maybe a lot of retail stores, that corporate data center or office may want to host all the equipment on their site, and then they kind of act as the service provider to all their retail stores as well as their corporate locations. So that private cloud just allows them to control, again, the security, control the administration, and allows them a lot more flexibility than a traditional on-premise would be, because they can often utilize the efficiencies of centralized management too. So you don't have to have an expert at each of their retail locations about the phone system. The guy at corporate or whatever can administer that and take care of that, and you don't have to have necessarily boots on the ground in a lot of cases at that local environment. So they get that advantage of all the cloud offerings, but they've got the control and the security of the private cloud. And of course, that allows them to select, the various carriers, data centers, and everything that they want to look at from their side. It allows them to look at the feature set. One disadvantage that I hear from some people in the cloud offerings is that, it's a multi-tenant offering. So not that it's just shared or a security concern, but that, this is the feature set. And that may be somewhat robust, but there may be very little customization you can do because the carriers or the hosted providers have to, produce that for the masses. So that feature set is going out to everyone, so they don't allow a lot of customization. So with a private cloud or hosted solution that's hosted internally, they can often tweak and customize those feature sets to their specific needs and gain those efficiencies that they can't in a traditional cloud model. Of course, they can choose their various endpoints, deployment schedules, and allows them to work on their own business continuity plan. And that's kind of back to the ownership I mentioned before, because, I work with carriers, quite regularly, but my trust issues sometimes are limited. I like the old Ronald Reagan proverb that he borrowed, I think, from one of the Russian prime ministers at the time, but trust but verify. So I like to really understand what's going on with my technology. I like to be in control of it, and that allows them that ownership in their continuity plans to not rely on an outside source, but to rely on their own W-2 employee, their own FTE in this kind of private cloud environment. And so that's all about the control and everything that we talk about there in that bottom point. The other thing for enterprise solutions are really about the OpEx model, but they want that customization and control. So, we can make that happen here at Optus too. So, we can put that together on a lease, a rental. There's all kind of options where you can get that to an operating expense, even if it is a private cloud model. And, as I mentioned, some customers have that level of administration that they want to take care of ownership. Others don't. They, even at a larger corporate level, they may still want to hand off that administration to someone else, and that's fine. We'll treat that as a managed service. We can customize that plan for them and do all their moves, adds, and changes, or do anything that they need us to do, just like we were on their staff. So, that hosted model and that private cloud really allows for that flexibility. It's still easy to scale, and it allows you all that feature set that you're used to in the traditional CPE equipment or customer premise equipment, if you will. And again, as I mentioned, wrapping that managed services around it really enables you to get the best of both worlds. It's, that having your cake and eat it too. You get all the benefits of the on-premise stuff, the flexibility, the control, but you also get some of the cloud environment as well. So just another consideration and something that we, again, see a lot of enterprises really looking at because of, their needs, their security concerns, and everything along that line. You can often offer multi-geo-redundant data centers so that there's a complex layer of failover and reliability, so that maybe there's a corporate data center, a failover, and you could have, even a tertiary or more level if, you need those 5 or 6 nines of reliability. And that's something important. If you do a true hosted with a carrier or someone else, you always want to understand what that failover looks like or what the reliability is. Definitely don't, if you're going with a hosted solution, investigate Bob's hosted telecom service before you go into it, because Bob may be running a server out of his house, and if that server goes down, that's it. You want to make sure there's some geographic redundancy so that if the primary server goes down or the primary hosting equipment goes down, there's a secondary or even a tertiary for you. How does that connect? What are the different layers of connectivity you have off-premise to that? So just asking those questions as you're investigating cloud solutions or hosted solutions, making sure you understand, what you're getting and what you're paying for in those situations. And, I think we mentioned before, but just, I often compare, hosted to like, renting something. That's whether it's renting a house or whatever. There's a lot of good features, and I mentioned before at Optus, we'll often have our administrative people dedicated in some cases that can take care of that phone system for an enterprise environment. And it's much like renting a house. It might not make sense to other people, but if you don't want to mow your yard, if you don't like to fix the hole in the wall that your son threw the baseball through or whatever, that's part of those offerings in either a hosted or a managed solution where you can kind of offload that headache to someone else. So definitely very interesting and very compelling for SMB but still a compelling argument for a lot of enterprise customers as well. And I think the one point that I do want to drive home, and kind of the start of our presentation, though, is, are key systems going away? Are they still relevant, et cetera? And I think we have to say that the enterprise space still has a majority of key systems out there. Although hosted is gaining ground, depending if that's private or public, anything, it's still a very true fact that on-premise CPE is still king today. And we see that, across most organizations. And, it's good to try different technologies, just make sure you're investigating the full functionality, the full feature set, understanding that redundancy and failover that anybody has to offer. Most of the equipment, though, we notice out there today are really a mixed bag. Even the stuff that's on premise, people often have a Nortel equipment that's still out there today, especially in retail, Cisco equipment, Avaya equipment, NEC equipment, and that's either through acquisition, different changes in leadership. Most enterprise security leaders especially are have a very strong background, and oftentimes that background, comes through in every technology that's purchased while that person's in tenure at his company. So just being aware of that, and then looking at consolidating those offerings, and that's one area that the hosted solution can often do, is be a good solution across a multi-site environment for all those disparate systems. Either a private cloud or a public cloud can often be a good case for that. Because oftentimes just the ripping and replacing all the systems at once isn't a good idea, though. You often see that as a phased approach in various companies, or even a managed offering with a provider that's managing and willing to manage the multiple systems that you have out on site today. One item that we see that's often challenging for especially the newer hosted providers is paging that we kind of mentioned here. So again, another thing just to watch out for. Some companies can handle this, some don't. Even the companies that have paging, though, I would say, in their hosted environment are often using like an ATA or IP converter that's converting an IP signal over to an analog to do paging integration. So in theory, while that's fairly sound, we'll often see that, traditional things like paging or even faxes really like true analog signals and can cause some issues. So if your environment or business relies heavily on paging, analog faxes, definitely making sure that you're doing your due diligence at looking at a hosted provider, or even maybe that's still where the on-premise solution makes a lot of sense for you, because we see so many issues with IP paging out there today. In a decade, that's probably going to improve greatly. But much like faxing, if people's been faxing over IP, initially there's been a lot of challenges with that. It's getting better and better as the years go in. But the paging integration is something that hasn't changed in the industry for years. So a lot of new technology does not anticipate that need out there. So making sure that you're doing that if you have that need is very important. So we're just going to kind of wrap up with some of our key points here. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no shortage of opinions on what the future of telecommunications will hold. There's a lot of variation. There's a lot of companies in that. You'll see more and more consolidation as that goes on with the various hosted companies. And, so going with name brand, carrier grade type technology is definitely a better solution than, again, going with Bob's hosted environment typically. But understanding the value, the reliability of that company, and then, looking at different solutions like maybe hybrid models like we talked about before with, on-premise equipment, but then, someone else managing that for you like we've done here at Optus, or even at a private cloud solution if the public offering doesn't make the most sense as well. So evaluating your options. If you've got questions, we're glad to answer those from here. Feel free to contact us, and we'll definitely help with that. But as with most product solutions, it comes down to finding that right solution for each customer. No customer is the same, and we understand that. So evaluating the different solutions for your particular needs is really what we try to do here. So making sure that if you're doing that with us or someone else, that you're doing your due diligence and homework to make sure you're getting what's the best fit for you. So with that, we'll stop and pause and see if there's any questions for us at this time.
We have not had any questions come through, but I had a question, Shane. I know you mentioned earlier about the different industry trends moving towards hosted, but what type of businesses have you seen move to hosted, like retail or what have you.
Yes, certainly. So the most common hosted deployments we see today are typically in SMB, small shops, especially new startups, seasonal areas. But, we see that more and more starting to creep in on enterprise, but mostly the smaller locations, less and less in enterprise unless it's a private cloud offering. But, for single sites, or even if you've got a multi-site office, but it's, smaller, maybe 5 or 10 offices, oftentimes a hosted solution can give you connectivity that you might not get otherwise because of the network requirements, but the carrier might be able to do that for you. So definitely the SMB, we see the hosted taking off quite a bit more. But again, the key systems are still around and relevant today, but it's just another offering that people can look at. And as I tell my wife all the time, I love options. It's good to have options to look at, see what the best fit for you is, because one size definitely doesn't fit all, and that's true with hosted or any kind of technology offering.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So you have a few minutes to get your questions in. I'm just going to wrap up and just remind you once again that after this webinar is finished, I will email you the recording along with the PDF that kind of discusses what Shane talked about today. And then if you are interested in the slide deck, you can email info@, and I will certainly shoot that over to you, not an issue. I'm going to check one more time before we say goodbye. Okay. No questions, so I hope you all learned something new today. And then if you have any questions, email info@, and I can get that and give it to whoever it needs to go to. And so be on the lookout for some webinars in the future. We will be sending out those email invitations about once a month. And that is all that we have for today. So thank you guys for attending, and we really appreciate it.
Appreciate everyone's time.
Have a good day.